Barron Trump stood up as Professor Lewis mocked Melania. His response shocked everyone. There are moments in life that seem small, insignificant even, but they hold the power to change everything. A typical college classroom, a sharp-tongued professor known for her bold critiques, and a quiet young man, one who had spent years in the shadows, never drawing attention to himself. But that day, when his mother was mocked right in front of him, Barron Trump did something no one expected. He stood up. The room fell silent, and then a single sentence, piercing and filled with conviction, shook the entire lecture hall. It left the renowned professor speechless, sent shockwaves through the classroom, and ignited a national conversation when the video went viral across America. What really happened in that lecture? What made someone who had always chosen silence finally speak up? And how did a professor so confident in her own beliefs find her perspective shattered in a single moment? This is a story that will challenge the way we see others, the way we judge, and the way we listen. Let's uncover the truth behind that unforgettable day. The bell rang in Lecture Hall 204 at Westwood University, one of the most prestigious schools in Massachusetts. Students filed in, chatting animatedly, laughter mixing with the rustling of notebooks and textbooks. No one knew that this class would soon become the talk of the nation. In the third row, a young man sat quietly, just as he did every day. Barron Trump, son of a former U.S. president. But today he was simply Daniel Barron, a student who had chosen to hide his real identity in order to experience life on his own terms. He didn't want special treatment. He didn't want judgment, positive or negative, because of his last name. He wanted to be seen for his mind, not his lineage. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, Barron exuded a calm, almost unshakable presence. He was not the loudest in the room. He did not seek attention. But there was something about him, a quiet strength, a depth that set him apart. He was always watching, listening, thinking, and when the moment came, he would not remain silent. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with us as we dive into a confrontation that would change everything. At the front of the lecture hall, Professor Martha Lewis entered with an air of confidence. Her sharp gaze swept across the room, her neatly styled short hair framing a face that exuded intelligence and authority. At 50 years old, she was a seasoned media critic, a frequent guest on major debate panels, and a name that carried weight in academic circles. To her, a classroom was not just a place for teaching. It was a battleground for ideas. She scanned the room, then flashed a knowing, almost provocative smile. Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to discuss what truly makes a public image powerful. The class sat up, intrigued. Professor Lewis's lectures were always sharp, sometimes controversial, but that's exactly why students loved them. In the front row, Jessica Carter, a top student in the Media Studies program, sat upright, eyes gleaming with interest. Jessica was brilliant, sharp-minded, but she had a deep skepticism toward politics. To her, world leaders were nothing more than carefully crafted personas, polished by PR teams to fit whatever narrative the public wanted to believe. She was convinced that the truth was always far messier than what appeared on TV. She nudged her best friend, Mark, who was busy adjusting his phone camera. "Here we go again," she whispered. "Who do you think Professor Lewis is going to tear apart today?" Mark chuckled, lowering his voice. "As long as she doesn't go after someone in this room, we should be fine." Neither of them knew that today's discussion would turn into something far bigger than just another debate. Professor Lewis turned to the board and with a flourish wrote 2 words in bold letters: perception versus reality. The room fell into an anticipatory silence. Something told Barron this was not going to be an ordinary lecture. And he was right. Professor Lewis turned back to the class, her piercing gaze sweeping across the room. "We often believe the images that the media presents to us," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, is it the truth?" The room fell into a focused silence. Let's consider an example, she continued. A public figure, always impeccably dressed, reserved, mysterious, but admired for their elegance. We don't know much about them, yet society celebrates them. But is that real value, or is it just a carefully crafted illusion? She paused for effect, then turned to the board and wrote a name that instantly made Barron's chest tighten. Melania Trump. A shift rippled through the lecture hall. Some students exchanged amused glances. A few chuckled under their breath. Barron clenched his hands lightly. He knew this wasn't going to be just another lecture. Jessica leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "This should be interesting," she murmured. In the back, Mark casually adjusted his phone, unintentionally hitting the record button, completely unaware that he was about to capture a moment that would change Barron Trump's life forever. Barron sat still, barely breathing. He had promised himself he would stay unnoticed, that his identity would remain hidden, but as the professor's next words echoed through the hall, he knew he wouldn't stay silent for much longer. "Let's take Melania Trump as an example," Professor Martha Lewis began, crossing her arms and standing tall in the center of the lecture hall. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before a smile crept across her face, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives right before delivering a cutting argument. "Let's talk about Melania Trump," she said, her tone laced with subtle mockery. "A woman praised by the media for her elegance, her flawless appearance. But tell me, has she actually contributed anything meaningful to society?" The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. A few students let out soft chuckles, others exchanged glances, waiting to see where this was going. Barron tightened his fists under the desk, his heartbeat pounding in his chest, but he stayed silent. He knew better than to react too quickly. In the front row, Jessica raised an intrigued eyebrow. "This is going to be a good one," she murmured. Professor Lewis walked over to the board and wrote 2 words in large letters. Then, turning back to the class, she posed a pointed question. "We live in a world where image often outweighs substance," she said, her voice razor sharp. "Melania Trump is celebrated for her grace and composure, but is she truly a role model worth honoring?" The classroom buzzed with murmurs. "Let's look at the reality," Professor Lewis continued. "We had a first lady whose speeches were often overshadowed by comments about her accent, rather than the substance of her words. A woman who launched the Be Best initiative to combat online bullying, yet was married to a man infamous for his controversial remarks on social media." Laughter erupted from a corner of the room. In the back, Mark, always on the lookout for viral moments, suddenly raised his phone and began recording. Something told him this discussion was about to take an interesting turn. Jessica nodded in agreement, resting her chin on her hand, eyes gleaming. "She's got a point. We tend to admire those with a polished image, forgetting how much of it is just media manipulation." A student in the back raised their hand. "Professor, are you saying we should judge people based on their actual contributions rather than just their public image?" "Exactly," Professor Lewis nodded, her eyes lighting up as more students engaged. The murmurs grew louder. Some students leaned in, eager to debate, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But amid the divided reactions, one person remained completely still, like the calm before a storm. Barron lifted his head, his eyes sharp, unwavering. Every word from Professor Lewis felt like a dagger cutting deep into a sense of pride. He could handle pressure, he could tolerate criticism, but this was different. They were mocking his mother, a woman they knew nothing about. She wasn't just an image, a decoration, a carefully curated persona. She was a woman who had left a small town in Slovenia, traveled to America alone, and built a career from nothing. She didn't crave the spotlight, she never sought validation, but that didn't mean she had done nothing. Barron felt his blood heat up. Should I stay silent or should I say something? He wondered. He scanned the room. No one knew who he really was. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't speak up, no one else would. Professor Lewis had no idea she had just pushed one student in the room past his breaking point. She smirked slightly and continued, this time with even sharper sarcasm. We can celebrate someone's elegance all we want, but tell me, does elegance change society? If we're looking for a true symbol of strong women, why not talk about Michelle Obama or Eleanor Roosevelt? Women who actually made a difference instead of someone who just looks good in photographs. Laughter rippled through the room. Jessica let out a quiet chuckle. Mark leaned in and whispered, well, if there are any Melania Trump fans in here, they're probably fuming right now. Then suddenly the quiet student in the third row raised his hand. The atmosphere froze. Professor Lewis paused mid-sentence, her sharp eyes snapping toward Barron. A few students turned in their seats, curiosity flickering in their expressions. This was new. This was unexpected. Jessica arched an eyebrow. Weird, I've never heard him say a word before. Mark, sensing something big was about to happen, quickly switched his phone to record mode. Barron took a deep breath. He no longer cared. Would go down in history. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a palpable tension. Barron's words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge them. Professor Lewis stood still for a moment, processing what had just been said. The sharpness in Barron's voice, the unwavering confidence, had cut through her defense like a knife. She was used to controlling the room, shaping the conversation, but this time, the room had shifted its focus entirely onto her. She had no response at first. Her gaze flickered as she met Barron's unwavering stare, the words she had so confidently prepared suddenly feeling hollow. Is that so? She finally managed, but her tone lacked the usual sarcasm, the usual bite. Barron held her gaze without flinching, his expression calm yet filled with a deep intensity. Yes, Professor. My mother is not the image the media has painted of her. She's a woman of substance, of perseverance, and above all of dignity, something that far too many have overlooked. The room remained silent, absorbing every word. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, listening intently. Mark, still recording, was on edge, fully aware that what he had just captured was something much more significant than he could have anticipated. I didn't ask for this, Barron continued, his voice growing steadier, but sometimes silence is the enemy. Sometimes you have to speak for those who can't. My mother has spent her life building something on her own, facing criticism, ridicule, and judgment every single day. And what do? We sit here and reduce her to nothing more than a media image, a story fed to us by those who only see what they want to see. Professor Lewis opened her mouth to respond, but Barron cut her off, his words now a force that couldn't be halted. You say my mother launched the Be Best initiative, and it had no impact? Well, I ask you, Professor, did you ask the children who were bullied? Did you ask the families who were torn apart by online harassment? My mother didn't do it for the applause or the recognition. She did it because she believed that kindness and respect should matter more than the noise that surrounds us. And yet, all we hear is criticism. The professor remained silent. The once confident and assertive leader of the classroom seemed small in comparison to the young man standing before her. Barron's voice was now like a quiet storm, unwavering and filled with pride, but without anger. Maybe it's time we stop listening to the narrative that others want to tell us, Barron said, his words lingering in the air. Maybe it's time we stop judging based on headlines and start looking at the real person behind the image. You're right, Professor. The media has the power to manipulate perception, but have you ever stopped to think that maybe you've been manipulated too? A deep silence enveloped the classroom. No one moved. Some students were too stunned to speak, while others were trying to process what had just happened. Jessica, who had always been quick to challenge others and was certain in her skepticism, felt a shift inside her. She had always seen Melania Trump as a carefully crafted figure, a shallow reflection of the media's demands. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Barron had said things that challenged her beliefs, things that made her question the narrative she had accepted for so long. Mark, realizing the magnitude of the moment he had captured, quietly lowered his phone. He had just recorded something that would resonate far beyond the classroom. Professor Lewis, after a long moment of silence, finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "You've certainly made your point, Barron." Barron nodded once, his eyes still locked on hers. "I just want people to stop and think. Behind every person we criticize, every judgment we make, there is a story. There is a person who deserves to be heard for who they are, not just for the image others choose to project." The class was silent, the gravity of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Barron had spoken not just for his mother, but for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly, anyone who had ever been misrepresented. In that moment, the lecture hall had become a space for truth, a space where perceptions were shattered and real voices were heard. Professor Lewis turned to Barron, her eyes softening as she finally acknowledged him. "Thank you, Barron," she said, her voice steady but filled with a sincerity that wasn't there before. Barron's heart skipped a beat. The entire class, once buzzing with energy, now turned their attention to him. It wasn't just the professor's words that stood out, but the profound shift in her demeanor. The usual arrogance, that air of superiority that she carried in every class, was gone. In its place was something different, something more reflective, more genuine. He didn't need to respond. He didn't have to say a word. The moment spoke for itself. This wasn't about his fame. It wasn't about his identity or who his father was. No, this was about the power of speaking up when it truly mattered. He had spoken the truth, and in that one moment, the world in that room had shifted. The professor had acknowledged it, and in doing so, so had the rest of the class. "Last week, a student made me think a lot," Professor Lewis continued, her voice calm now, without the usual bite. "I've always prided myself on teaching my students to ask the right questions, to challenge the narrative. But I forgot something important. Sometimes, I need to question myself, too." The room fell into a deep silence, each student absorbing her words. The shift in tone was palpable, and it was clear that something had changed. Not just for the professor, but for everyone listening. They weren't just hearing words, they were feeling the weight of them, the gravity of the situation. Professor Lewis took a slow breath and began again, her voice now growing firmer, more deliberate. "We live in a world where information is easily distorted, where it's far too easy to believe the surface of what we see, to accept the narratives that are fed to us by the media. We've all been guilty of it. I know I have." She paused, and the room seemed to lean in, waiting for her to continue. "But if there's one thing I've learned in this past week, it's this: everyone has a story, and no one deserves to be judged solely by the image we've been given of them." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in this classroom, it was as if everyone had been forced to confront something deeper. The assumptions they had made, the judgments they had cast without truly knowing someone, began to unravel. Professor Lewis paused for a moment, letting the gravity of her words sink in. Then, turning toward Barron, she added, "Thank you, Barron." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The students, once skeptical of the conversation, were stunned into silence. They had seen Professor Lewis at her sharpest, her critiques, her biting analysis of public figures. But now, they were witnessing something entirely different, something human. The usual authority she exuded had been replaced by humility, a rare and powerful thing. Barron didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The words, the unspoken recognition, the shift in the professor's stance, it was enough. He had done what he set out to do. He had made a point, and in doing so, he had made an impact that would resonate far beyond that lecture hall. The truth he had spoken had begun to change not only Professor Lewis's perspective, but also the students around him. They would never see the world in the same way again. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a catalyst for reflection, for change. As the lecture continued, the atmosphere felt different. The walls of judgment and prejudice that had once seemed so thick had now cracked. A new understanding hung in the air. The students who had once been quick to judge, to dismiss, now found themselves listening more intently. They were no longer just observing. They were contemplating. For the first time, the classroom wasn't just a place for lectures. It was a space for reflection, a space where ideas could be challenged, where truths could be questioned, and where new perspectives could emerge. The professor's once unshakable stance had softened, and in that moment, she had shown her students the value of humility, of self-reflection, and of understanding. Barron knew that this was just the beginning. He had spoken for those who often went unheard, for those who were judged too quickly based on shallow assumptions. But as he looked around the room, he realized that, for the first time, the students were listening. They weren't just hearing words, they were considering them. And that, to Barron, was the true victory. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. As the students began to gather their things, no one moved quickly. No one was in a rush. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the moment that had just unfolded. They would never forget what had happened that day, the moment when silence was broken and the truth was spoken. Through the classroom, some students had already suspected the truth, but this was the first time Professor Lewis had publicly acknowledged it. Mark's eyes lit up with excitement, while Jessica smiled, not just in surprise but in admiration. After class, Barron stepped into the hallway, taking a deep breath. He hadn't done this for fame. He didn't need praise or recognition, but he knew one thing: a seed had been planted. And for those who sat in that classroom that day, something had shifted. Jessica jogged up beside him, arms crossed, smirking playfully. "You know, you just did something no one thought was possible," she teased. "You made Professor Lewis rethink her own views." Barron smirked slightly, shaking his head. "I don't need her to completely change her mind. I just need her to start questioning her own beliefs." Mark suddenly appeared, phone in hand, grinning. "Hey, Barron, your video just hit 20 million views. Got anything to say to your new fan base?" Barron chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't have a fan base, Mark." Then he paused slowly, turning toward the camera. His expression was steady, thoughtful. "But if there's one thing I want people to remember, it's this. Before you judge someone, make sure you know their whole story." Barron Trump's story was never just about him. It was a story of conviction, of the courage to stand up when it mattered most. And more than anything, it was about learning to listen before rushing to judge. We live in a world where information is manipulated, where people are labeled too easily, too quickly. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to pause, to ask more questions, to listen more than we assume. Because behind every name, every image, there is a real person. Barron let out a small chuckle. "I don't need her to change completely," he said. "I just need her to start questioning her own beliefs, and that's enough." From behind, Mark suddenly appeared, phone in hand. "Hey, Barron, your video just hit 20 million views. Any words for your fans?" Barron shook his head, laughing. "I don't have fans, Mark." He paused for a moment, then looked directly into the camera. "But if there's one thing I want people to remember, it's this. Before you judge someone, make sure you know their whole story." This wasn't just about Barron Trump. This was about conviction, about the courage to stand up when it matters most, and above all, about learning to listen before we rush to judgment. We live in a world where information is twisted, where people are labeled too easily. But maybe, just maybe, it's time we all pause. Time to ask more questions. Time to listen more than we assume. Because behind every name, behind every image, there is a real person. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Barron asked, his voice soft but firm. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after truly understanding them? If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.